Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we got another top 10 list. The top 10 worst hit songs of 2010. What? You thought these retrospective lists would only cover the best of each year? Yeah, eventually we were going to have to get here. And we might as well start off with the first year in the 2010s left uncovered. But first, a quick recap of some of the chart trends of 2010. A year that was knee-deep in the club boom, somewhat evenly balanced between the songs that believed the party would never end, and those who were desperately pretending that it wasn't happening at all. And what was very telling is how both sides of that binary wound up on the best and the worst list, which you would think would just balance everything out. And yet, that's where you'd be wrong, because the bad songs seem to grossly outweigh the good in 2010, and hitting the lucrative balance between offensive, obnoxious, or just plain asinine. More to the point, it was also a year where flimsy production has aged rather badly, and it was everywhere in the Hot 100. And sometimes, a song sounding like ass, that's all you really need here. Now granted, 2010 is one of those years where the factor of, oh, this sucked, but nobody cares anymore. It was a bad trend. Why revisit it? And that tends to be a hidden truth about the Hot 100. Bad trends, they will age badly. But the songs are so disposable that nobody really cares all that much, which tends to paint the years in a better light than they might have. And while this is very true of some forgotten crap, there's also some hits on this list that somehow remain big to this day. Either because the artists are still celebrities, and probably shouldn't be, or the radio is entrenched them as recurring staples because nobody with brain cells came in the day that they decided to put on syndication. And again, the songs, they had to debut on the Hot 100 in 2010. It's widely considered a pretty rough year for the charts, all the more tainted by the fact that I personally spent way too much time in the club in 2010. So let's go back to the Gungy after party, rightly forgotten, and the morning hangover that somehow has not gone away, starting off with number 10. So okay, one thing I try to keep in mind for these lists of the worst hit songs of any given year is that dance crazes are just that. They're crazes. They're inherently disposable. They're here for a brief spurt of time, maybe a year at most, then everybody's faintly embarrassed for them for about a decade, and then they become staples of your next wedding reception, and they will never go away. It happened with Soulja Boy, it'll probably happen with Silento's Watch Me, it probably already has happened with this song, and yet somehow I kinda doubt it, because on some level, the dance craze has to, make you wanna dance, not do this.
Taste me how to duck, taste me how to duck, taste me how to duck, taste me how to duck.
Everybody love me, everybody love me.
So look, on some level, there's not much you can even really say about this song. It doesn't even have much of a melody, just some rattling percussion and vocals that from the sound of, I really don't want to be here, so let me act like I don't care and pretend that's charisma. But that's really only part of the problem, because this track fundamentally fails in its basic concept of teaching anyone to do anything, instead relying on the lean back by Terror Squad conceit that unless somehow somebody actually moves while dancing, the cooler it might be. And in an era overstuffed with blaring, in-your-face synthesizers and dance jams, it's startling how lifeless this feels even away from the contrast. Now, sadly, or maybe not, the Cali Swag District could never really escape the shadow of this song, with two of their members dying in the years that would follow, and all subsequent singles and albums either flopping or being shelved. But they still have this, right? Yeah, not much to really speak for. You know what, let's just move on. Number 9. Alright, look, I am an Usher fan. I have been for years. He's one of the most talented and charismatic R&B acts of the past 20 years, and he has a few legitimately great albums, and Raymond v. Raymond is not one of them. Instead of following the intense vulnerability that gave Confessions a real emotional core, he slipped towards the messy trends that a bad release strategy only further emphasized. And let me be blunt, Hey Daddy, Daddy's Home, it's only missing this list proper because of good delivery. Certainly not because of the production or anything that Usher actually said on that song. Even Plies didn't do well there either. But with that single only producing moderate success and Lil Freak sputtering out early, he needed a win. And with this single, he might have gotten it, but in the long run, he might have actually preferred the loss.
Oh my God.
Man, this brings back memories. Hazy nightclubs where this goes off and everyone tries to get into it, but the sluggish tempo and underwhelming delivery rarely has the flair that it really should. And anyone trying to catch a good vibe off of Usher's lower delivery has to deal with the very censored, oh my gosh, and that's where you get to the verses talking about the girl's boobies, or the fact that she's now talking about breaking down the target of his affection. And that's not even touching on the fact that the drums are so underweight, the crowd noise only seems to add to the overmixed failure to be anthemic, not helped by the synthesizers that are more texture than tone, and are somehow as loud as Usher's voice. But you can likely all place the blame for that at the feet of the producer and the guest star, will.i.am, who not only poorly used Usher here, but through his mixing choices and the hideous auto-tune, made it clear that he thought he was the star of the show here. Yeah, we'll get back to that in a short time, but in the meantime, yeah, this is really bad. And it was huge and it shouldn't have been. Next. Number 8. So when I made my list of the top 10 best hit songs of this year, I highlighted how it might have been kind of easy to hate on a certain glitter-smeared faux trashy party girl in this era for being openly sleazy and obnoxious. And while I've certainly warmed to her a lot more over the 2010s, I'm not deaf. I get where the criticisms came from, even if I thought they were kind of oversold and more than a little bit condescending, especially from guys who would give rock stars and punks every pass in the world for a lot of the same material. That said, I do have a line, and it's this.
Coming at your mouth with your blah blah blah. Zip your lip like a padlock. And meet me in the back with the jack of the jukebox.
That grating beep, that omnipresent clap that somehow will cut through even the slurry of electric effects as the auto-tune malfunctions. And for some ungodly reason, a third verse given to the sentient embodiments of douchebaggery in 303 that were long past their 15th minute before society realized that being an asshole ironically still makes you an asshole. But I cannot solely blame them for this. Kesha's made plenty of trashy hookup songs in her career, and while I like a lot of them, this is none of the coursing rock groove that makes Dirty Love or Gold Trans Am so much fun, and all the electro clash squeak that rides on incoherence and only gets worse from there. And yes, I get that it's at least trying to be somewhat flirtatious and there's an audience for this, but to get this dumbass just shut up and fuck her already? But I gotta imagine there are better dicks for her to ride than anyone associated with this song. And that very real possibility that with 303's verse, Kesha could be branded as just as annoying. They could be talking to each other. And while she managed to mostly get away from all this, well, yeah, we'll come back to it. Number 7. But on the topic of insufferable, repetitive, and excruciatingly annoying, so I think it's well known at this point that the Black Eyed Peas, for as much as they got legitimate praise for I Got a Feeling, they were beginning to test everyone's patience by 2010 before crashing and burning hard in 2011. And I put money that I'ma Be was the song that probably got there the most. Somehow going to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on garish bombast, a watery snap beat, hideously dated auto-tune and synth choices, and repeating the phrase I'ma Be until your ears bleed. And that's where you tack on the gang vocals and a wonky beat that might be the most oily and headache-inducing off-key squonk I've heard in a pop song this decade. And that's where you get to anyone actually on the song, with Fergie's laziness highlighting the very bottom rung of her artless arrogance, will.i.am comparing himself to a sperm bank, and then trying to justify the mindless filler writing by saying that's because he's popular. And you know what? He's probably right with that one. Where else could you possibly get away with rhyming million with billion with trillion, rhyming bouncing them checks with itself, describing himself as the average brother with soul, where there's somehow no soul to be found, and overall some of the weakest rhymes this group has ever delivered. Folks, there is a reason that even when the Black Eyed Peas get brought up and praised today, this song doesn't, 'cause it's horrible. Number 6. So I've said before that 303 were approaching their asshole behavior kind of ironically. I mean, that was the only excuse why they got a pass in 2010. Right? I mean, they were dicks, but they kind of knew they were dicks, but them kind of owning it in the wave of late 2000s frat boy obnoxiousness and let them get away with a lot of it because the tunes were good, or at the very least, heavy. But again, I think everybody had a line. And for me, well, it was really long before, but this was in it.
My first kiss went a little like this. and twist. And twist.
There are so many misconceived elements on this song, it's hard to pinpoint where to even start. For one, the production's dreadfully thin, which shows up worse than the percussion, but doesn't help the compressed guitar leads carry much of a tune. Apparently this was being done to place 303 at the front of the mix, which is asinine because their falsetto is painfully weak and their meat-headed shouting hits the very precise nerve between obnoxious and yet not being interesting enough to back it up. But that's the same deeper issue that highlights why 303 was never any good. They aren't even all that interestingly bad or obnoxious. If this song is about your first kiss, why is so much of it in the present tense and the machismo is such an overblown put-on? How is it possible to waste Kesha by having her serve bored accents and backing vocals? And why in the nine hells did you think the falsetto scatting on the bridge would fit with anything? I mean, thank God Kesha was the one who wound up with a real career and not these two, and this dumpster fire of Axe body spray and mugging assholery has promptly and properly been forgotten. So yeah, let's move on. Number 5. And speaking of duos who should have never had a career...
She ain't gon' tie me down. Why you on the road? Got it on the shirt, saw the hats, saw the clothes. What you want right now?
You know, going back to dig up the minor success of duos like the New Boys is kind of fascinating, especially when you dig up how the hell they were a thing to begin with. And then in this case, they were a jerkin dance duo who went viral off a cheap dance hit, got signed to Asylum, and then put out 2 albums of some of the worst singles around the turn of the decade. And while some have associated them with the hyphy scene, I've never really heard a good word about these two, especially as the brand of pop rap they put out has aged remarkably badly. I would say their struggle to say that this was their worst single when Better With the Lights Off still exists, but yeah, it's pretty atrocious. The cheap canned synths, the snap beat, the gang vocals, the awkward attempts at crooning off a mediocre hook from Ray J. But the fundamental flaw, it's obvious. These are 2 kids trying to sell how they're such studs in high school that they won't get tied down. Of course, all this operates on the premise that either of these 2 are so insatiably attractive that anybody would want to fuck them, especially at their age. But that would involve either showing a distinctive personality beyond some awkward Lil Wayne imitations of arguably one of Lil Wayne's worst eras, or, you know, actually saying something worthwhile. But for the most part, it's just dated and embarrassing by 2 twerps who are never all that good or interesting to begin with, and trying to follow in Justin Bieber's lane and coast on charisma and talent they did not have. In other words, there's a reason that pretty much everyone has forgotten this song. Next, number 4. I don't think I was the only one who heard Man of the Woods last year and then went back to old Justin Timberlake and Timbaland songs with the uneasy thought that many of these tracks were probably never that good to begin with. Now for me, just confirmed a lot of what I already knew. Most of his albums are bloated, they're overproduced, and did occasionally capture some real gems, some tight grooves, and just enough ego to hold together. But if you thought the corniness was something that was new...
Take my order, cause your body like a carry-out. Let me walk into your body till you hear me out. Turn me on, my baby, don't you cut me out.
I think even Timbaland knows that his late 2000s work is crap. Even outside of the beats that he outsourced or his very questionable choices behind the microphone, at this point of his career, he and Justin Timberlake were pushing hits to the top on ego and star power alone. And Carry Out is one of the worst possible examples. The production is probably one of the biggest culprits here. A grainy fizz right against the clinking percussion, the garish horns, and a clunky non-groove, and either the auto-tuned warble of Timbaland trying to sound imposing, or Justin Timberlake trying to ride his multi-tracking to form some sort of groove and maybe a decent melody. Now, all this would be pretty rough to work with, and then it's compounded by being a sex song overloaded with fast food puns. And while I get that the collective lyrical standards took a nosedive around the turn of the decade in terms of the gibbering nonsense that we allowed on the radio, why didn't somebody stop them from making Katy Perry's Bon Appetit 8 years early, and then somehow worse? The non-rhymes, they are stacked and blatant. I don't see how any woman would find being described as Carry Out remotely sexy, and you know what, even if you're into that sort of thing, I'm not sure you'll want to then be serenaded by Timbaland saying that he'll have you open all night like IHOP. And yet somehow JT's even worse. He asks if he's full of himself to want you full of him. He follows it up with saying that he is well seasoned, and then follows it with how he'll walk into your body until you hear him out. And then tries to make the bridge sexy by framing it as a drive-through order. The only reason I can see this song existing at all is for many of the same reasons we got asinine, overreaching, conceptual sex songs all across JT's entire career, especially in the deep cuts. Nobody on his team told him no. And in this case, if a waitress had kicked him out of the Wendy's, we wouldn't have this food and audio poison. Let's move on. Number 3. So look, I get that pop trends are moving quickly around the turn of the decade, and young but limited personalities need to find a niche and find it fast, so it makes sense that pairing two kids with more money than good taste and sense together and see what diseased pop alchemy would spit out, I get it. Most often it's just kind of forgettable, as to the majority of the mainstream public this has been, but it still deserves a thorough excoriation and roasting regardless. Alright, look, I have stood up for Sean Kingston probably more than I should have, but before J.R. Rodham would hitch more of his wagon to Jason Derulo, he tested his sample-heavy scheme with Sean Kingston in the 2000s and a selection of big, doofy hooks in that era. Most of them haven't really aged well, but there is a pop formula that saves them from being less than mediocre. Unless, of course, it became a duet and the song turned to absolute crap. It happened in 2008 with a waning Natasha Bedingfield on Love Like This, and some things actually got worse with the anti-charisma wonderkin Justin Bieber in 2010. And while a song like Baby probably got more hate than it deserved 10 years ago, outside of that ludicrous guest verse, which again is somehow a lot worse than you probably remember, Eenie, Meenie, Minie, Mo Lover is a disaster from front to back. And let's start with the fundamental premise. For as much as the indecisiveness of this girl is emphasized in the song on the verses, doing Eenie, Meenie, Minie, Mo, it's actually pretty damn direct. Now, if you want to say that she's capricious or flighty, that's a different conversation, but you didn't say that. But it also raised the question, why on earth Justin Bieber and Sean Kingston are chasing her to begin with? Unfortunately, nobody's hammered enough common sense into these two just yet, so they actually think they can be slick and, Justin Bieber can say shoddy, but the seduction techniques and the rapping are as amateurish as to be expected. But the truth is that none of this song's got much flow or groove, but the production is probably the biggest culprit of all of it. Folks have already pointed out how so much of this song imitates Sean Kingston's marginally better song Fire Burnin' from a couple months earlier, but to me, the flattened synth tones, the overmixed percussion, it smacks of that early Benny Blanco production credit, and it reminds me just how intolerable he was in the early 2010s. And sure, all this song is trying to be is bubblegum, but it's really bad bubblegum. Compression to mush with two young acts that are hopelessly out of their depth, saddled with the song that is played to none of their strengths. In other words, there's a very good reason why this has been forgotten. Let's move on. Number 2. Well, say what you will about Carry Out or Eenie Meenie, they've mostly been forgotten. Most people like to pretend that Timbaland's Shock Value 2 album also didn't come out, and it's not like any of this has been showing up on any of Justin Timberlake's medleys recently, and Bieber, he sure as hell's not playing Eenie Meenie at his shows. No, folks, if you want a song that's actually stuck around, to the excruciating displeasure of anybody near adult alternative radio,
Hey, soul sister, ain't that Mr. on the radio, stereo.
There's bad writing, there's most of this list, and then there's what Pat Monahan of Train does to this song, which just so happens to be the incredibly successful reason that this mediocre white bread non-entity got a second life in the 2010s. I should start with the fact that there's nothing soulful about this song, anything of the implied sisters thereof. Weak-ass jaunty ukuleles are not impressing any of them, boys, and considering when my mind hears Soul Sister, I think of Lady Marmalade, and I'm fairly certain every woman on that song would castrate this band with nail clippers. It might explain why Pat Monahan's yelps and painfully weak falsetto sound like somebody had waxed his gonads. I mean, why else would he bellow out how his heart is beating out of his untrimmed chest on his second verse, how much he's praising that the hair is clearly on his mind? But that almost leads me to the theory this could be an anti-love song. I mean, why else would you describe lipstick stains on the front lobe of your left side brains, or how her smell is in all of his dreams, or why for some ungodly ungodly reason, he calls her a game show love connection. Or in the most bafflingly misconceived choice to date, the one we've all memed, he says he's so gangsta, he's so thug. But the infuriating part is that it's being plainly sold as sincere, because the other half of the song is drenched in straightforward 80s references with no cohesion, and there's nothing saying that this could be satirical. Hell, Pat Monahan said in interviews he was trying to write a song like In Excess, and somehow he produced a grocery store staple to faintly nauseate anybody who's paying attention. But that's the sick nightmare of this song. It's just bouncy and catchy enough to disguise the alien atrocity beneath its skin, disguised as a love song to be sung at karaoke by the same people who don't realize that Semi-Charmed Life is about crystal meth addiction. And yet, surely as it will be recorded as a footnote in the downfall of Western civilization in the 2010s, it lingers like an antibiotic-resistant venereal disease on playlists to this day. And more of that specifically is reserved for another list, but in the meantime, our dishonorable mentions. Look, I get why it happens when songs leak basically unfinished and the artist basically winds up releasing the version as a single. It's not ideal, but if you're new in the scene, you do what you have to do. But Your Love has always been representative of Nicki Minaj's least interesting side. A sloppily mixed mid-tempo ballad that leans way too hard on the auto-tune and the Annie Lennox sample and shows Nicki sounding at her most disinterested. I mean, at least the rapping connects together kind of okay, although saying that she'll die hard like Bruce Willis and saying that she loves him like she raised him raises all sorts of questions. Also, there's hashtag rap, which sounds kind of weird to rip on now in the era of trap repetition, but still sounds really stilted in retrospect here. But you know what? We'll get to a little more of that in a bit.
I'm trying to find the words to describe this girl without being disrespectful.
I'm more forgiving of Akon than most, but this is one of his worst songs because it exposes just how goddamn clumsy he could be. Don't worry, she's not the neighborhood hoe. He's not trying to be disrespectful. She's just a sexy bitch. A phrase that is hammered into incoherence by that hook. Well, Akon, would there have been a problem if she was the neighborhood hoe? Are you trying to hold her to a double standard that I guarantee you would not follow? Stop hoe shaming! Now, granted, all jokes aside, what kills this is the production. David Guetta got a lengthy pass for I Got a Feeling that frankly should have ran out 7 years ago, but it should have ended with this. Thanks to the blocky synths, the muddy vocal mixing on the hook, and the weird stutter clap on the hook that sounds so limp and utterly lacking punch in the low end. Man, so much of this 2010 production has aged badly.
Forever young, I wanna be forever young.
Jeez, Jay-Z, could you sound less like you cared? Yes, we all know the biggest issue with this song is Mr. Hudson's warble against a gutless and thin production that is coasting way too hard on the Alphaville sample and some ugly, buzzy drums, not one of Kanye's best productions. But Jay deserves some blame on this too. This was Jay-Z and full-on, I need to entrench my legacy, work with the Barclays Center mold. And if you draw a comparison to the hunger that he brought years later on 444, this is him in a slump. The flow is blocky, the writing is a rote, and while there are hits on the Blueprint 3 that were actually kind of working, this is by far one of his worst. It's not terrible, but I'll never want to listen to this.
Rock your body.
People tend to forget just how many songs the Black Eyed Peas got off of The End, and this is one that doesn't quite get as much vitriol as it probably deserves, likely because of that liberal Rob bass sample. But it still sounds grainy and overmixed, especially with that synth choice, and then we get a chipmunk voice from Fergie, as if she couldn't be annoying enough yet. That's typically the point where I'll check out, but the rest of the Peas actually do get verses off. Verses that remain completely pointless because this is the Black Eyed Peas in 2009 and 2010 making a dance song. Next.
My room is the G-spot. Call me Mr. Flintstone. I can make your bed rock. I can make your bed rock.
Look, I mean, the meme is grocery bag, but an influx of ridiculously corny lines from the rest of Young Money and on the hook, this leaves me feeling faintly embarrassed. And I get that it's supposed to be loose and goofy, but somehow Drake is the only one who actually gets a decent joke off, and the rest seems weirdly preoccupied with all the different ways they're going to knock this girl out with their dick. Seriously, both Lil Wayne and Guetta bring it up. And that's where you get Tyga arguing about TV schedules, and even Drake drawing on Talladega Nights references. Hell, with Lloyd crooning about how their room is the G-spot, I got serious questions how any of them managed to find it to begin with. They're probably still lost outside.
You never say hey or remember my name, and it's probably cause you think you're cooler than me.
No joke, when I made this list originally for my own personal records, this song topped the list. I hated Mike Posner's limp anti-charisma, his flailing attempts to neg this girl that reads like a pickup artist at 2 a.m., and the desperate insecurity that sits at its core. Also, and this is not a joke, this was a song that my residence floor in university chose as a theme song to perform at the yearly coffee house. I seriously question how any of us got laid that year. It's also a song that feels more gimmicky than anything. It could have easily gotten back onto this list, but you know what, that chugging synth gurgle is actually pretty likable, and I do think the bridge is melodically sound. Of course, none of it is helped by Posner trying to drop out the instrumental multiple times, but hey, be thankful for small blessings here, which is probably what any woman who goes home with Posner will probably say.
Say something, baby. Say something, baby. Say something, baby. Say something. I'm gonna need you to say something, baby.
Can we just write off this entire era of Timbaland's production? Cause this sounds like gurgling ass with overmixed percussion and Drake desperately trying to croon over any bad facsimile of melody. Apparently this is being framed as a post-breakup song that's trying to be both celebratory and regretful. Let her down easy sort of song. But normally the emotional core of that is not rooted in pleading on for her to validate you. Also, it's kind of hard to get past, sounding like gurgling ass. But those are all the dishonorable mentions. Now for number 1. At the end of the day, as I've said before, the worst hit of any year normally transcends just being a terrible song. No, it's gotta linger and leave some sort of skid mark through time, the possibility of causing lingering cultural damage. It's one reason why Hey Soul Sister is so damn high on this list. But upon reflection of both the song's quality and what it's left for us across the 2010s, it wasn't gonna be anything else.
I know you mad for some words. I wish you best of luck. Now I'm finna throw them deuces up.
Let's make this clear. If Deuces had flopped hard, we probably would have been spared Chris Brown across the past decade. I mean, think about that for a second. And how often Chris Brown has showed up on the worst of lists, and then ponder that if this had flopped, we could have escaped all of it. Imagine what R&B could have been. Hell, I'll go one further. If this had flopped, Tyga probably would have suffered a serious setback too. And considering all the junk that he's put out, can you imagine what the states of R&B and hip-hop could be? So many bad albums and bad singles and publicity nightmares that could have been avoided. But instead, America chose to give a microphone to an abuser who put Rihanna in the hospital. And no, I'm not going to ignore the cultural context of why this was wretched in 2010. And given how Chris Brown keeps referencing his past on hit songs this decade, I don't see why I can't bring it up now. So what, we're supposed to ignore how this turd is framing this as a girl being emotionally demanding on an ugly breakup song? And then how Kevin McCall says, like, Tina did Ike in the limo, it finally hit me. So you're now framing the girl as abusive after what happened for Chris Brown just a year before. Now granted, this is a Kevin McCall verse, and with a charming line, I'm a dick, so it shouldn't be hard to swallow, but let's just try to consider the song as a purely toxic breakup, framed where nobody's likable. That could be feasible given the bleak keys, the very clipped sandy knock of the percussion, the curdled auto-tune and backing vocals, just a wallow in a lot of bad taste and misery where there's no good melody. All the focus though is on our dynamic trio. But then you have Tyga here who can't even sell being a prick as well as Chris Brown or Kevin McCall can. And the toxicity, it's not even consistent. I'll make the very same comparison I did to 2018 with Tebote. For this sort of song, you want genuine resentment and anger, a really good hook, and then brevity. Get in, get out. Which is why my go-to in this lane is Heartbreak by Yelawolf. Great song. But this track is a cheap attempt to rewrite Chris Brown's narrative, which fails by the third verse, and the hook is foul, and the tempo adds no sense of groove or momentum. And the fact this was a hit, it gave us a decade's worth of Chris Brown and Tyga songs to follow. Yeah, without question, the absolute worst hit song of 2010. Hell, let's hope we can keep this noxious legacy for just this decade. We don't need it in the 2020s. So yeah, Deuces. And fuck Chris Brown. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Hey, if any of you guys actually want to put in your picks for what you would consider the worst hit songs of 2010, links down below. Put your comments in. I'd be happy to hear it. But beyond that, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.